sitting in a church service. The pastor has just finished his sermon and is now calling up members of the student ministry to talk about their recent trip to Haiti. Students spend 10 minutes thanking the congregation for their support and can't express how deeply the trip touched them. They show a PowerPoint filled with pictures of smiling children and talk about how their lives will never be the same. But strangely, the presentation tells you very little about the people they actually went to serve and how they were affected. Today, the church has a dangerous habit of emphasizing how short-term missions make us feel over how they actually impact people in poverty. I'm not usually a very emotional person, but it grieves me to hear about children who are still dying from preventable diseases like polio, women who are forced by poverty to go to the streets, and men who can't make the money they need to feed their families. Poverty is more than a distant problem. It's a deadly reality. Because of that, I believe that our outreach to third world countries has to be about more than doing things that make us feel good. It has to genuinely help. In light of that, I want to persuade you to reevaluate the usefulness and impact of short-term missions by looking at 3 points: the myths, the math, and the mistakes. Unless otherwise noted, all information in this speech comes from the report Short-Term Missions, a trend that is growing exponentially, written by Dr. Don Vanning. Most mission trips sound great on paper, but the church needs to ask itself the hard question: how much are we actually doing for people in need? Regrettably, the impact of short-term missions is often overinflated. This brings me to my first point: the myths. When I ask people why they support short-term missions, usually the first thing that they talk about is the impact on the volunteers. These missions broaden horizons, foster a deeper love of God, make people more likely to give to charitable causes, and maybe even become career missionaries one day, right? Unfortunately, missions aren't changing people the way they're expected to. Award-winning journalist Stan Guthrie reports about how the exponential growth of short-term missions has been unsuccessful in increasing the number of career missionaries and annual giving towards charitable causes. Oftentimes, the impact of a missions trip is really just a spiritual high that makes volunteers feel good for a few weeks, but doesn't cause what experts refer to as a paradigm shift, a true change in mindset. And even if this weren't the case, the goal of missions should always be best helping the people we are serving, not ourselves, shouldn't it? The second thing that people usually talk about to support short-term missions is evangelism. They argue that if even one person comes to know Christ, then surely the trip was all worth it. But there's no reason that local ministries can't be equally effective at spreading the news of Christ. For example, sociologist Kurt Alan Verbeek studied volunteers from local ministries and short-term missionaries as they built homes for survivors of Hurricane Mitch in Honduras. He found that locals and short-term missionaries had the same spiritual impact on the people they were serving. And most of the time, I would venture to say they can do an even better job because they know the local language, understand cultural customs, and can build relationships that last longer than a few weeks. Thinking back to when I was an unbeliever, I probably wouldn't have accepted the gospel after spending less than a week with a foreign volunteer who barely spoke my language. And I don't just think that local ministries are preferable when it comes to evangelism. I think they're also the better choice when it comes to relief. This brings me to my second point: the math. Let's say that you have 5 kids who all really want ice cream, but you only have a few bucks to spend. You could use that money to buy one child ice cream from an ice cream truck. Or you could take that same amount of cash, go to the grocery store, and buy an entire box of ice cream sandwiches that all of your kids could share. If you're like me, you'd probably go with option number 2, because it would mean that all of your kiddos could get a treat. This same kind of logic applies on a grander scale when we're talking about whether to support short-term missionaries or local ministries. Let's return to that example of Hurricane Mitch. On average, it cost Americans about $30,000 to build one home because of the cost for lodging and travel. When local ministries did the work, the cost was on average $2,000. The quality and spiritual impact was the same. The only difference was homes built by Americans were 15 times more expensive. Verbeek interviewed several organizations that worked with short-term missionaries during this time. 5 out of 6 of them agreed it would have been better if the churches had just sent over the money that they'd used to pay for the trips. We all want the most bang for our buck. Why not go to the grocery store instead of the ice cream truck? Darren Carlson, the founder of Training Leaders International, gives us another example where this is the case. A campus ministry decided to go to Central America in order to repaint an orphanage. With the amount of money that they used to pay for the trip, they could have hired 2 local painters to paint the orphanage, 2 full-time teachers for the orphanage, and bought a new school uniform for every child there. That's pretty unsettling. I also decided to do a little bit of math on my own. I went to Compassion International's website to find out what their charity could do with $3,000, a pretty average price for one person to go on a mission trip overseas for 1 week. $3,000 could sponsor a child for the next 6 years. It could give 88 children access to clean water. It could buy 100 children the textbooks they need for school this year. It could give 300 children Bibles for the first time. Or it could treat over 400 children who are suffering because they have parasites. While we may feel inspired to personally help a community, we need to realize that money is sometimes better spent empowering local ministries. This is not only more cost-effective, but also provides an income for the locals who do the work instead. And we can always take that passion to personally volunteer and plug it into our own cities. You don't have to fly halfway around the world to find somebody who doesn't have a roof to sleep under. The last point that I'm going to talk about is probably the most important: the mistakes. We need to look at the mistakes that we've made when it comes to serving children. The United Kingdom's Telegraph reports about how orphanage volunteers could be causing serious and irreparable harm. Sarah Barham is a representative for ResponsibleTravel.com, an organization that supports ethically minded tourism. She says, quote, "We are concerned that despite their best intentions, orphanage volunteers are part of the problem rather than the solution for children living in poverty around the world." End quote. The United Nations has found overwhelming evidence that orphanages damage children emotionally and physically. They say that foster care programs or programs that reunite children with their parents are often a much better choice. But people's desire to donate to and visit orphanages has created a booming industry. In West Africa, orphan dealers kidnap children or convince their parents to give them up. They then take them to orphanages where they make money off of the volunteers who pay to visit them. Shockingly, 90% of the orphans in Ghana aren't actually orphans. And of the 148 orphanages there, only 8 of them are actually licensed. And this isn't just a problem in Ghana. According to UNICEF, a branch of the UN, 80% of the 8 million children living in institutions around the world have at least one living parent who could be taking care of them. Those who don't often have a relative who will be willing to take them in. In addition, visiting genuine orphans can also be a problem. Children aren't tourist attractions, and the line of Westerners coming to take photos can be an invasion of privacy that's psychologically damaging. Most volunteers aren't properly trained to interact with traumatized children, and they often seek to form an emotional connection with them. This creates a never-ending cycle of abandonment for children who make and lose a friend every time the next set of volunteers rolls around. UNICEF doesn't recommend going on any trip where a volunteer would work directly with children. But if you still feel motivated to do so, they recommend that you stay in the country for a minimum of at least 3 months and only work at screened orphanages. Or better yet, volunteer with a family-centered organization that will help to reunite children with their parents. To find a list of credible orphanages and family-centered organizations, you can visit UNICEF's website at thinkchildsafe.org. So to sum everything up, there's a couple things we should consider before we support short-term missions. First, we need to debunk the myths, so we can honestly evaluate the impact of these trips. Second, we need to do the math, so we can get the most bang for our buck. And third, We need to learn from mistakes we've made in the past so we can avoid putting children in danger. So let's make short-term missions less